Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 37, Thursday, March 26, 2020.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Emily.
Oodalali, everybody. It's great to be back. Another podcast, another week, and ready to have another author interview.
Yeah, today we are pleased to welcome another special guest. He's the author and editor of over 50 unique titles, many of which focus on Disney. There are currently over 20 volumes of his Walt's People series from Theme Park Press, and 5 volumes of They Drew as They Pleased, which focuses on the history of Disney animation decade by decade. We recently read the most recent edition, focusing on the 70s and 80s, and we're excited to dig into them on the show today. Welcome to the show, Didier.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Didier, before we jump into the book, we want to learn a little bit more about you. So can you tell us a bit about your journey to become a writer and why you like to write about Disney?
Yeah, of course, with pleasure. So I became interested in Disney really when I was about 7 years old. And I grew up in France. I grew up in Paris and then in Geneva, Switzerland. And in France and in Switzerland, one way to really get addicted to Disney, if you want, is not so much through the cinema, through the features or the shorts or things like that, but you really start getting addicted through the comic books. Comic books are still a really, really big thing in a lot of countries in Europe, and especially in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy, and so on. And so I grew up reading Le Journal de Mickey, the Mickey Mouse magazine in France, and that's how I really got to know Mickey Mouse and all of his friends. And then when I was growing up, obviously I watched all of the Disney features and the shorts. Through 16 millimeters that my father would bring home, and also on TV. And then when I became a teenager, first I realized that other people were sharing my passion for Disney, and I started corresponding with them, and a lot of them were in the US, so that pushed me to learn better English and to start writing also in English. And then when I was, I think about 15 or 16 years old, the Disney studio decided to buy a studio in Paris. And by then, when I was 16, I was back in Paris. And I decided, wouldn't it be fun to try and meet the people who work at that studio? And wouldn't it be fun to try and interview the heads of the studio? And so the heads of the studio were two brothers, the Brizzi brothers. And I decided to contact the studio and to tell them, you know what, I'm writing for an American magazine called Animation Magazine, and I would love to conduct an interview with the Brizzi brothers for that magazine. Well, between us, Animation Magazine had no idea I was doing that. They didn't know me at all. But the Disney studio in Paris said yes. And so I interviewed the Brizzi brothers, and I sent that interview to Animation Magazine. And guess what? They were actually interested in releasing the interview in the magazine. So that was my first published interview. In fact, that was my first interview with any Disney artist. And so I thought, okay, this is pretty cool. And the stories that the Breezy brothers told me were absolutely fascinating. Are there other artists that I could interview? And I was lucky because that studio had just opened in Paris. Some major Disney artists were coming to Paris to work there. And so one of them was Andreas Deja, the animator behind Jafar and Scar and King Triton and so on. And so I decided to try and interview Andreas Deja. And luck was on my side. One day when I was actually at Disneyland Paris, in one of the stores outside of the park, I saw a guy with a Walt Disney Feature Animation Friends bag. I'm like, okay, there aren't that many of them around, so who is that? And then I looked at him and I recognized him from some of the bonus features from some of the VHS tapes from that time period. And so I went to him and I say, are you Andres Deja? And he looked at me like, who's this French guy who knows me? So I explained who I was. And then he said, yeah, absolutely. I would be glad to be interviewed. And so I did conduct an interview with him. And then that led to more interviews with a lot more Disney artists, including Glenn Keane and a few others.
Yeah, 20 volumes is a lot to fill with all of those. So I'm glad that you've been able to find these people and talk to them. It's good learning for us as well. You know, it never just hurts to ask. All they can do is say no. So we'd like to dig into this more recent series, They Drew as They Pleased. What kind of started this project? Was it always going to be multi-volume, multi-decade, or was it more you had so much research that made the most sense?
No, so when I started They Drew as They Pleased, really the project was pitched to Chronicle Books, the publisher, always as a multi-volume series. And at first, it was supposed to be a 5-volume series. And then I realized at some point when I was working on volume 1 that when it came to the 1940s, which was going to be the second volume, that volume really had to be split into 2 volumes because there were too many artists that I wanted to discuss and just too many artwork that had been created in the 1940s to fit into 1 volume. So thankfully, Chronicle Books were very flexible on that, and they said, yes, okay, for 6 volumes. You can do more than 6, but 6 is fine. We'll support you with that concept. And so that was just absolutely wonderful. And from day one, the concept of the series was really twofold. The first part of the idea was to say, you know, from my standpoint, the most fascinating artwork that the Disney studio has created is not so much what you see on the screen, which is beautiful, but you already see it on the screen, so it's there for everyone to enjoy. But what's really special are those pieces of concept art, of visual development art, of pre-production artwork that are created before the movie really enters into production and that are there to inspire the other artists. And those pieces of concept art are just absolutely stunning pieces of artwork. It's the closest you get to the artists themselves. And the very sad thing about those is that not a lot of them had been seen before. The books that had been released over the years about Disney that showcase some of those pieces of concept artwork, of visual development artwork, would tend to use again and again and again the exact same pieces of artwork. About 100 different pieces of artwork, maybe 200 pieces of artwork. And I know that there were thousands and thousands that were preserved at Disney's Animation Research Library, and that no one had seen them before. And I thought that was really extremely sad, and that really someone needed to start opening those boxes and sharing what I would find with the people who are passionate about this artwork and that really wanted to discover more. And obviously, I was the first one to be very, very passionate about that. So I was doing that first and foremost for a very selfish reason, which is I wanted to see that artwork. So that was one reason for doing that series. The second reason is, as you know, when you watch a Disney movie, the name that really dominates everything is the name of Walt Disney. And so that name of Walt Disney really is the name you remember. But to an extent, it's a little bit unfair because there were so many incredibly talented artists that would contribute to those movies that I thought it was high time, now many, many years after Walt Disney's passing, it was really high time to put a spotlight on those artists and to an extent, give their names back to them and to treat them as individual artists with their own individual styles and their own individual talent, and really do a sort of art history that would focus on one artist at a time, in a way, and really go in depth into their life and their careers. And so that was the second source of inspiration for that series. And so in the end, you have that series, which, again, when it's complete later this year, is going to be 6 volumes long, and where each volume contains about 90% of artwork that has never been seen before, and about 80%, 85% of the written information is based on documents that have been recently discovered or that have been recently unearthed and that we hadn't seen before. So that's the philosophy behind the series.
That's really cool. And after I read this particular volume, I watched the Disney films in the 70s and the 80s. I watched Robin Hood, rewatched The Rescuers, and one of my favorites, The Great Mouse Detective. And I looked for their names. I had never really looked for Mel Shaw or Ken Anderson's name before. And I looked for it, and after looking at the artwork, it was cool to see where their concept designs did make it into the film. And I love that juxtaposition. So that worked. I think it works really well. Your series is doing what I think you want it to do. I saw it.
Well, that's wonderful news. And I would say that one other thing I really wanted to do was to help connect the dots. That has in everything I've been writing about Disney, that has always been one of the key goals. And by that, what I mean is when you read a biography of Walt, when you read a book about Disney history, in a lot of cases, they tell you, well, this happened in 1941, and then Walt switched to this project in 1942. And you're like, okay, this is great, but how did we go from point A to point B? What happened in between? What were the steps that actually made Walt go from point A to point B? And the reason in a lot of cases why you don't have those intermediary steps is that a lot of those authors of Disney history really focus on what made it to the screen, what people have seen and that has been released. But to really understand the history, you need to understand also the history of the projects that were abandoned, the projects that were started and never completed. And you could probably see that in this volume that you just read, when you read the history about how the Rescuers were created, for example, you see that right before he worked on the Rescuers and created all of those wonderful characters for the Rescuers, Ken Anderson, the key concept artist who worked on the Rescuers, Ken Anderson, before that project, had worked on a project that was very, very personal for him and a project that he really, really believed in, which was called Catfish Bend. And he had developed all of those wonderful, absolutely fascinating, absolutely compelling characters for Catfish Bend. And that project, in the end, was shelved. And a lot of those characters that he created for Catfish Bend were characters that he then adapted for the Rescuers. But if you don't know about Catfish Bend, it's really difficult to understand the genesis of those characters for the Rescuers. The same thing is true for Robin Hood. When you look at Robin Hood, the whole thing only makes sense, the whole history of the design of those characters only makes sense when you start focusing on some of the projects that Ken Anderson had worked on before, like Reynard the Fox. And when you hear the story, when you read the story of Reynard the Fox and of that abandoned project again, then how Ken finally decided to create all of those characters for Robin Hood and how he designed them, that's when it starts making sense. And it becomes a lot more fun, and it takes a completely new dimension.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the Reynard the Fox the most because we're going to ask you about your love of Robin Hood in a minute. But I felt the same way, and I really loved those drawings. But I want to go back to something you said before, that most of your series is 80 to 90% art that has not really been featured before. But I'm sure you saw a lot more artwork than what made it into these books. So how did you choose what did get into the volumes and what didn't?
Well, it was obviously a very subjective choice. I tried to do two things. The first thing is I really wanted to have as many of the projects that those artists worked on represented, because from a historical standpoint, I really wanted to show illustrations for all of the projects. The thing is, there's a question of the drawings that I liked and the drawings that I liked less. And so from that standpoint, that's very subjective. But then, in parallel to all of that, I just tried to include as much as possible in those books without the drawings being so small that it would make the enjoyment of them problematic. And so I crammed as much artwork as possible in those books. And one of the things I made sure I did is, let's take the example of the chapter about Mary Blair. Well, Mary Blair, in volume 4 of the series, Mary Blair has been discussed in several books in the past. The books by John Canemaker, catalog of exhibitions in Japan, catalogs of exhibition in the US, and so on and so forth. And what I decided to do for Mary Blair is I checked all of those catalogs. I checked all of those books that had been released before. And I checked piece by piece every single piece of artwork that had been released in those books. And what I did then is I made sure that I selected for my book only pieces of artwork that had not been included in any book before this one. Why? Because I just wanted to have as much new things as possible. This is a unique occasion to show artwork that has not been seen before. It has to be beautiful artwork, but it also has to be unique and released here for the first time, because I assume that people already have all of the other books. So I just want to basically try and open a new field of understanding about her artwork and what she did.
Well, we're so grateful that you went to all of that hard work to include it, because that really was a treat to see a lot of stuff we hadn't seen before, even as big Disney fans ourselves. I'm curious about the other side of your research. So in addition to the pictures, there's of course stories about the two animators that you focus on, Ken Anderson and Mel Shaw. I saw in your notes that you reference your other series, Walt's People, some interviews from there. So I'm curious, was this a blend of new research and old? What all did you rely on for those stories?
So it's for those two chapters, especially, I relied on a lot of new research.
Awesome.
So there were two different things that I did that were really the two pillars of the research for those two chapters. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about the research for previous volumes. But in this specific case, for the chapter on Mel Shaw, what I had discovered about 10 years ago, something like that, is that Mel had written an autobiography, the manuscript of an autobiography. And I don't know if you remember, there was a magazine released by Disney many years ago called the Disney Magazine. And in the very last issue of the Disney Magazine, one of the journalists wrote about that autobiographical manuscript that Mel Shaw had written at the time. And I won't tell you the whole saga about that led me to finally put my hands on that manuscript. But let's just say that it involved Walt Disney's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, and Mel Shaw's daughter-in-law, and who also happens to be the daughter of one of Disney's 9 old men, John Lansbury. And all of those factors came together to allow me to finally get access to that autobiography and to help the family of Melchior release that autobiography, which I knew was a very critical first step if I wanted to get access to really new information about him and as much information about him and his life as possible. So all of that to say that the research sometimes leads to some very fun outcomes, which are not planned at the beginning, like helping the family of Melchior release Melchior's autobiography. And then in parallel to that, obviously, I started establishing links with the family of Melchior. And so they gave me access to all of his archives, gave me access to all of his artwork, gave me access to everything that he had preserved over the years. And that was an outstanding treasure trove. To give you a sense of how big a treasure trove it was, when Mel passed away, the family had to buy a full house just to store the amount of artwork that he had preserved. So it took months for a friend of mine in the San Francisco region to scan all of that artwork for me and to allow me to basically select the best artwork out of all of this. For Ken Anderson, a similar process happened. The first thing is I knew that there was a lot of information that was buried in some interviews, in a very, very long series of interviews that had been conducted by Ken Anderson by a Disney historian called Paul F. Anderson. And Paul had conducted, I think, about 20 interviews with Ken over the span of probably 40 hours or something like that. And none of them had been transcribed, or maybe one of them had been transcribed and released into Walt's People, but all of the others had not. And so I suggested to Paul, I said, if I find people to transcribe those interviews and if I find people to edit them and so on and so forth, would you allow us to release them in book form? And so he did. And so there's a full volume of interviews with Ken Anderson that was also released in parallel as a result of that research. And then again, I connected with the family, with the 3 daughters of Ken Anderson, and they opened their archives and we scanned everything. And what's really fun always is when you do that, you sometimes stumble upon things that you absolutely do not expect. So there were drawings by Ken that I did not expect. There were documents that I did not expect, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, there were also things that helped me for other volumes of They Drew as They Pleased. I was at the time I was researching Volume 5. I was also working on Volume 4, and in Volume 4 you have a chapter about an incredibly stylized artist called Tom Oreb. And Tom Oreb worked on all of those Disney commercials from the 1950s, for example, and he was very instrumental also in designing a lot of the characters for Sleeping Beauty and so on and so forth. And when I first met the family of Ken Anderson, they showed me all that their father had preserved. And the first thing I was attracted to was a big envelope. And when I opened the envelope, there were hundreds of concept drawings for Sleeping Beauty. And I realized in about 10 seconds, 15 seconds, that 80% of those were created by Tom Oreb. And so I almost fainted. I mean, I couldn't believe my eyes. And the best part of this is I also realized immediately that those were some of the earliest character designs for the characters in Sleeping Beauty. Very, very, very far from what ended up on the screen, but fascinating, absolutely fascinating from a historical standpoint and from a visual standpoint. And so you see pages after pages of those drawings in the 4th volume of the Didier Ghez. So that gives you a sense of the type of research I would conduct to find information on those artists. And of course, also a big part of the process is to go to the Disney archives and to basically review every single file you can think of that might have even a tenuous connection with the life and the career of those artists. And so you go through page after page after page of documents, hoping to find one line, two lines that will enlighten some lesser known aspect of the career of those artists. And sometimes you make some pretty cool discoveries, pretty fun discoveries.
That's like every Disney fan's dream, everything that you just described, finding new artwork, making connections with people all over the country or even all over the world that contributed to Disney films. I'm just like smiling here. This is awesome. So to kind of wrap up about your overall series before we talk more specifically about the 70s and 80s, just what were some, throughout this whole project, what changes did you see in Disney animation over time, but also what elements did you see remain consistent?
Well, so what remains consistent, and that's really probably the main focus, is the fact that pre-production artwork, concept artwork, remains a very personal, a type of art form that's very, very linked to specific artists, and that they put a lot of themselves into that artwork, and that a lot of it, even today, is still created with very manual media. It's going more and more towards digital, but I can see still a lot of those concept artists, even in the last volume of the series, in volume 6, where I'm discussing the artwork of, among others, Mike Giaimo and Mike Gabriel, Michael Giaimo, and Hans Packer. Even then, where it covers the 1990s until today, you can still see that about 80% of the artwork is not created digitally. It's still created with those very manual media. So that really remains consistent, and the level of creativity also remains very, very consistent. What changes? Well, what changes is obviously in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on, you had a much more limited number of concept artists. You have many more of them today, but that's because the amount of production at the Disney studio and at Pixar has just skyrocketed. And also what is different is that more and more it is, despite what I said earlier, it is transitioning more and more towards digital. That is a fact. Those would be, I would say, the two key changes when it comes to concept artists. But the role of concept artists, the role of visual development artists, is still really, really critical today, as it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and more.
Absolutely, and it's great to see that you've chronicled it over that time. We're definitely now wanting to go back and read the other volumes and looking forward to the 6th edition, because I think that's going to have some of our favorites. But you mentioned in your preface, and I really enjoyed this, getting to hear that Robin Hood and writing this volume in particular is very special to you. So could you share with our audience a little more about why?
Well, the reason why is Robin Hood was released in 1973. And 1973 for me happens to be a very special year because that's the year I was born. And so I grew up really watching scenes of Robin Hood in 16 millimeter at our house in Paris, with my father really showing us short scenes of Robin Hood that were available in 16 millimeter, and running them over and over and over again for my enjoyment and my brother's enjoyment. So that's a movie that's really dear to my heart. And when I was researching the artwork behind that movie, again, 90%, 95% of that artwork was created by Ken Anderson. And all of the characters' designs were done by Ken, who also happens to be my favorite Disney concept artist. When I was researching that, came the day at the Animation Research Library when we were finally going to open those boxes of artwork from Robin Hood by Ken Anderson that had not been opened till the 1970s. And I was expecting some pretty spectacular stuff. And to say that I wasn't disappointed would be the understatement of the century. And so when the person who helps me there at the Animation Research Library started opening the boxes and with her white gloves on, started pulling one piece after another, literally those hundreds of pieces of character designs done for Robin Hood, I started crying. I mean, I was literally moved to tears. I mean, that was the moment I'd been waiting for close to 40 years, and I just could not believe my eyes. I mean, the amount of sheer beauty, the amount of sheer creativity that was in front of my eyes was just mind-blowing. And those were like hundreds of characters that did not make it to the screen. Hundreds of designs that were more fascinating one than the other. And you will see, and you have seen some of those in the book. And if I could have doubled the number of pages, I would have done it, and it would have been very easy because of the amount of creativity that was present in Ken's head.
Robin Hood's always been one of my favorites, and I don't think it gets the recognition in the Disney community sometimes that it deserves. So that was really, I know Courtney feels the same. She's always also loved Robin Hood.
I do. I think it was fun for me to see, so with our age, Emily and I are big fans of Beauty and the Beast. So I know it's not technically the 70s or 80s, but I did love seeing some of the art of Mel Shaw that you featured from that film. So we definitely have more to look forward to for the 90s, I'm sure.
Yes, you do, especially in the Hans Backer section of the of Volume 6, and even in the Joe Grant section. Actually, he created quite a few gag drawings for Beauty and the Beast. Really fun and interesting.
Hunchback is another really underrated film. So sign us up for Volume 6. We'll be reading that one for sure.
Kind of bouncing off the 90s a little bit, I want to reference your title that you call this volume, Volume 5, the 70s and 80s, the early Disney Renaissance. I want to know why you picked that title, because it's recognized in the Disney community that The Little Mermaid is the beginning of the Disney Renaissance. So why call this the early Renaissance? Why not pick a different title?
Because if you want to get Disney's approval, you really can't call it the Dark Ages.
That's fair.
But did you see anything from this artwork that really lent itself to where the Renaissance with The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, what they take from?
Yeah, so the reason why it was called the early Renaissance is really because those are the years after Walt passed away, and when the studio is starting to try and reinvent themselves. And so you start seeing you start getting within the studio some of the artists who will then be instrumental in creating the renaissance of the Disney studio. You start having some of the roots of what will come next, and you see that in some of Mel Shaw's artwork. You see that in the chapter where I discuss the whole character animation program at CalArts. You see that in the discussion of the new generation of artists that joins the studio, especially at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. All of that really creates the roots for the Renaissance that follows, starting with, The Little Mermaid, or just a little bit before that.
So I find it very interesting that you mentioned that new generation, because this really was the time period where a lot of them start to come in. But this edition focuses specifically on Ken Anderson and Mel Shaw. And I was actually surprised to see how much content there was, from the 40s, talking about works on Bambi and stuff preceding the 70s and 80s. What led you to pick those two artists in particular?
Well, so there's always, in this whole series, in They Drew as They Pleased, you always have a conflict between the fact that I'm focusing on some specific artists and the fact that the title of each volume includes a specific time period. And really, from my standpoint, the most important thing is to discuss in depth the artists that I've picked for the specific volume. So when it comes to the 1970s and 1980s, because we're talking about visual development, because we're talking about concept art, there are really only two artists that really dominated completely the field of concept art, visual development art in the 70s and 80s. And those were Ken Anderson and Mel Shaw. However, you can't discuss Ken Anderson, especially in the way I do things. You cannot discuss Ken Anderson by talking only about his work on movies from the 70s and 80s. You have to understand the full career of Ken Anderson from he started the Disney studio in the 1930s until his retirement in the 1980s. That's the only way I can think of doing things. And the same thing is true for Mel Shaw, which starts at the studio in the 1930s, leaves the studio in the mid-1940s or early 1940s, and then comes back to the studio in the 70s. Again, I couldn't see myself just discussing the work of Mel Shaw in the 70s and 80s. That isn't the philosophy of the series.
So thinking about their artwork in the 70s and 80s, what did you see really distinguished these two decades from other decades, from the Renaissance that's coming, but also from the decades that preceded these films?
Okay, so that's a very easy question. When you talk about the preceding decades, and even when you talk about the decades after that, the main focus of the visual development artist is to create a mood for the movies, to both design the environments and the characters. And so they have a very, very all-encompassing approach to how they see visual development. And really, when you look at the artwork from Ken Anderson, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, the key focus is on character development, is on character design. And there is a very good reason for that. The reason is as follows. When you are talking about all of the movies that were produced during Walt's time, for Walt, what was very, very important was to build a very strong story that worked from start to finish, and that would be compelling from start to finish. And then when he passes away, the person who takes the helm of the Disney studio is a person called Woolie Reitherman, one of the 9 old men, who really has wonderful qualities as a leader, and who is really the person who saves Disney animation after Walt is gone. But Woolie, his really forte is really great scenes with great characters. He doesn't necessarily have the same vision or the same talent as Walt for building a very compelling story from start to finish. He has a great talent for building really good scenes, which are supported by absolutely great characters. And so the emphasis of the studio then becomes to create more than great stories, great characters. And the animators love that because the animators are actors. And so what does an actor want more than anything else? He wants a great character to act with. And so the animators support that very much at the time. That is a little bit to the detriment of the stories themselves. If you see Robin Hood, even though I love, as I mentioned before, I love Robin Hood. If you see the Aristocats, if you see the Rescuers, you'll notice that the story is not necessarily as strong as it is in other movies. And that what really makes those movies different is the strengths of the characters themselves. And so that would be the big difference, I would say, between that time period and what precedes it and what follows it.
It was great to see some of those character sketches, especially the one that you referenced earlier with Robin Hood, and just, all of the different animals within that, I think, really make up the heart of that film. And so I'm curious, with all those sketches from either Ken Anderson or from Mel Shaw, did you have a favorite among those that you included in the book?
A favorite sketch out of all of them?
I know it's probably like picking a favorite child.
So the answer is no. I don't necessarily have a favorite sketch. However, there are some that are really special, that are really special for historical reasons. One of the ones that are really special for historical reasons is one of the two Elliot the Dragon character sketches by Ken. And there are two reasons why it's so special. It's a character sketch where you see only Elliot himself in profile. And the two reasons why it's so special is, one, because strangely enough, even though Ken designed Elliot the Dragon, and even though Ken was known for drawing and drawing and drawing more character sketches than you can think of, I couldn't locate many character sketches of Elliot. In fact, I was only able to locate two. And that specific one that I have in mind, I happen to own the original of it. And so that is obviously, it is very dear to my heart, and it makes it very special from my standpoint, aside from the fact that it is a really beautiful character sketch of Elliot.
That was really great to see. My boyfriend is a huge Peach Dragon fan, so I had to make sure to show that to him too.
Yeah, I was sad that I could not include more because they just weren't more. And even the second one, the one with Peter playing with Elliot, that one was difficult to locate. It was located in a private collection, and it wasn't easy to include in the book.
One of my favorites was Mel Shaw's work for The Great Mouse Detective. That one's always been one of my favorite films as a kid, and one that I usually introduce a lot of my friends to because they've never seen it. So I was really happy to see a lot of his beautiful, colorful sketches. His concept work is just beautiful. So much color.
I agree. I especially love the one with the villains. That
Yes.
are seated at the table. I mean, that one, I mean, the snake and the owl and so on. I mean, those are just, I mean, so vivid and those character designs, again, I mean, they just jump out of the page. I mean, it's just outstanding.
I liked Basil's different disguises that he sketched, and then Watson's next to him, just very confused. I found those funny. So from these sketches, you had brought up it was important for us to learn about these unmade, these different projects that got shelved. And while they were informative to future projects like The Rescuers, Robin Hood, is there one that you wish got made?
Oh, yes. I mean, there are a few that I wish got made. One of them would be Musicana. I always loved that idea of that new version of Fantasia, which I would have loved to see on the screen. And obviously, I love the idea of Reynard the Fox, just because of all of the links with Robin Hood. I would have loved to see that one on the screen, no doubt.
The Musicana one jumped out to me too, because certainly we got Fantasia 2000 down the line, but I liked the idea that this was focusing on a variety of different music from different cultures, and I think that would have been a really unique perspective. And then it makes me think, like, ooh, could that have been tied into Epcot by any chance with the different pavilions? So just thinking of things that could have been.
Agreed. I mean, you know that there was that African sequence that was developed by Mel Shaw, like all of the other sequences. And then in parallel to that, really, Ken Anderson was working on a proposed African pavilion for Epcot. So
yeah, as you mentioned,
you immediately see the connections.
Since we're also big park fans, this is more just a softball question, but do you have a favorite attraction at a Disney park?
I do now. I mean, I do have a lot of attractions that I'm a huge fan of, but what happened to me about 6 months ago is I was at Disneyland for the first time in quite a while, actually. And I was lucky enough to be there early January. Oh, so it wasn't 6 months ago. When was it? Oh,
it feels like 6 months because we've been inside.
It was actually just 3 months ago. Yeah, that was just the beginning of this year. And so I was at Disneyland at the beginning of this year, and I was lucky enough to be there right after the holidays. And what was wonderful is that the Haunted Mansion with the holiday edition of the Haunted Mansion was still open. And I had never been on that Haunted Mansion holiday edition with the whole theming of Nightmare Before Christmas. I was blown away. I could not believe my eyes. I had to go back on it, I think, twice, just to believe it. So that for now has become my favorite attraction.
Nice. Very good pick. I've been able to experience it. Emily, we're trying to get her to Disneyland eventually, but I agree.
It's a running theme of this podcast.
My mind was blown when I saw it because, you've been on Haunted Mansion, you've seen that attraction, but it feels like a brand new attraction in some elements. And I agree. I had to ride it more than once just to take everything in.
It's absolutely, from my standpoint, unbelievable from start to finish. I mean, I love Nightmare Before Christmas, and I love the Haunted Mansion, and I had the impression that they had just rebuilt the Haunted Mansion and created a completely new attraction. I mean, I could not believe my eyes, and I was kicking myself for not having found an opportunity to discover it a long time ago. I mean, that was just one of my best Disney parks experiences in a really long time. So yes, I strongly encourage you to find an opportunity to go there when it's open.
It's definitely very special. And I do want to take a moment to direct our listeners to your Ultimate Disney Books Network. Our friend Jim Korkis shared that with us. So we'd love to know just a little more about that project and if you have any books in particular that you'd love to recommend to our listeners.
So here's the way the whole thing started. I own every single book ever written about Disney history.
Oh my goodness!
And when I wasn't living yet in the US, and when the internet wasn't what it is today, so before your time, I used to write letters to people all around the US to try and find out what new Disney books were being released or were about to be released. And so I was keeping track of all of that with a manual list of books. And so I would keep track of all of the books that I had in my library about Disney and all of the upcoming books. And then at some point when the web came online, I thought, if I'm interested in that, maybe other people would be interested in that. And so I started sharing the list of all of the Disney books ever released, some additional information about them, what I thought of them, and what I thought was interesting about them, and what I thought was less interesting about them. And also a list of the upcoming books. And I'm not updating it as often as I should right now. I'm doing it through my Disney history blog more than through that site, but it's still, I think, a very good resource. And I do update it about once every 6 months or something.
It's such an incredible project. And now I want to see your library, because I know Courtney and I would be totally envious of how many Disney books you have. We're still growing our library as we do this podcast. And I know Courtney and I are now going to be looking to buy the rest of the volumes of They Drew as They Pleased. And you said the last one is coming out this year?
Yes, it is. Probably in August or September. Obviously, the timing might be a little bit affected by the current crisis, but should be around August or September.
So to kind of conclude, now that this wonderful series is coming to an end, what new projects are you looking forward to?
That's a very good question.
If you can tell us.
Oh, I can tell you. I can tell you. So I'm working on several different projects. So obviously I'm always working on more volumes of the Waltz People book series. So right now I'm working on volume 24 and volume 25. And by the way, those series, they contain some interviews that I conducted, but they contained a lot of interviews that were conducted by other Disney historians from the 60s until today. So it's not just my interviews, it's also interviews from a lot of other Disney historians, and I just act as the editor of the series. So that's one project I'm working on. The other project I'm working on is I'm editing a few manuscripts, autobiographies that had been lost and that I recently rediscovered. And I can't yet share the names of the artists who wrote those autobiographies, but let's just say that those are going to be absolutely fascinating when they are released. But then what I'm really working on right now, which is probably one of the most exciting projects I've ever worked on, although it probably will reach a slightly smaller audience. What I'm working on is two monographs, the first one of which is called The Origins of Walt Disney's True Life Adventures. And what this is a monograph that basically traces the roots of Disney's true life adventures from the work he did on Bambi to the work he did during World War II to everything that led to the production of the first of the true life adventures, Seal Island, and the first of the people and places, the Alaskan Eskimo. And so that is fascinating because this is a time period, this is a subject that has never been discussed before, and it's filled with photographs and illustrations that absolutely no one has seen before. And I've located so much new material, and it is fascinating from an ethnological standpoint. It is fascinating from a travel adventure standpoint. It is fascinating from a visual standpoint. It's fascinating at all levels. And 100% of the content, I would say, is brand new. It's a story that has never been told before. And then the volume that will follow that is a very interesting volume because what I discovered when I was researching that volume on the True Life Adventures is that by 1952, 4 years after the release of the first of the True Life Adventures, Walt was telling some people, you know what, not only do I have this series, which are the adventures in nature, but I'm also thinking of launching a series which is going to be adventures in music, and another series which is going to be adventures in history. And so that second volume of that new series is going to focus on the story of those three adventures: the adventures in music, adventures in history, and adventures in nature. And again, it's a long story, it's a complex story, and it's a visually absolutely compelling story.
That's a lot of projects. You have a lot on your plate to take care of this year and in the coming months. That's awesome. I know I'm particularly interested, now that you brought up the True Adventures. I don't think a lot of people we know of Disney Nature that's on Disney Plus and comes out every Earth Day, but I don't think people, like you said, know that history, that Disney's been making nature documentaries for decades. So that'll be really, really interesting. At least I know Courtney, is there one that stood out to you?
I'm interested in the music again. That's definitely right up my alley.
Oh, you're going to have a ball when that volume is released, because that story is just absolutely incredible. I mean, it starts in the mid-1940s, and then it really culminates in the 1950s, late 1950s, and it is just visually striking and so much stuff that no one has seen before, and such a rich story that has so many chapters in it. I think you're going to enjoy that very much.
So before we conclude and we ask you for our closing quote, we just want to introduce our next episode that will be coming soon with all this time that we have. We're really rolling out a lot of content, Courtney, so why don't you give us a preview of what we're doing next?
Sure. So while everyone was home, we had a little bit of fun on Monday on Twitter, and I just want to extend a thank you to those of you who joined our partnership with the Wed Reads account for our book discussion of Raleigh Crump's autobiography. It's kind of a cute story. We had such a great time that we're actually going to host a little podcast party for our next episode, so we'll be joined by the hosts behind the Wed Reads account, as well as the co-author of Raleigh's It's Kind of a Cute Story, Jeff Heimbach, and the publisher, Leonard Kinsey. So Emily, why don't you give them a little preview from the back of the book?
Sure. So the back of the book says, the Imagineers, those men and women who helped Walt Disney bring his creations to life, have achieved legendary status among theme park enthusiasts. It's Kind of a Cute Story is the life story of one of the most beloved Imagineers, Raleigh Crump. Covering his long and varied career, including designing some of Disney's most famous attractions and working directly with Walt himself, Raleigh's stories weave into a lighthearted yet riveting narrative of his life and accomplishments. Packed with over 200 photos, many of which have never been seen before, It's Kind of a Cute Story is a tribute to the life and work of a true original. I think we have a theme.
I was going to say, I feel like between reading Didier's book and this one, we got to see so much new artwork. Have you read that one, Didier?
So Raleigh Crump's It's Kind of a Cute Story is again, fascinating from start to finish, a really easy read, and very, very fun read, and one which is absolutely full of stories that I'd never heard before. So yes, it's a great book that I could not recommend more. That I really would recommend very, very, very warmly.
Perfect. We really enjoyed it, and we're looking forward to talking to another author for that. In the meantime, listeners can keep up with us for Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse, or email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. You can find me, Courtney, on Instagram at GreatGutsby and on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at Emily_McD. And Didier, where can our listeners keep up with your current projects, your upcoming projects, and what's the best places for us to buy your books?
Well, so the best place to follow my new projects is on the Disney History blog. And so you just type Disney History blog and you'll find it very easily. And then the best place to buy the books is really through Amazon, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll be sure to include a link to that. And we always like to wrap up our episode with a special quote, and we often have our guests do the honors. Do you have a quote to share with us?
I do. So I mentioned earlier that aside from being a big fan of Disney, I grew up reading a lot of comics and graphic novels. And so one of my favorite American graphic novels is Calvin and Hobbes. And one of the volumes of Calvin and Hobbes' title was There's treasure everywhere. And that would be my quote for today, because obviously conducting all of that research about Disney history, this is what I found. There's treasure everywhere.
There certainly are, and we're glad that you were able to share those treasures with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very, very welcome. It was a real pleasure.
Us too. Thanks, guys. Bye. Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.